I'm going to go ahead and start. It's 3:02, and would say that as we look at what the future of or what the current state of the market looks like, there's a couple things that jump out to me. And just a quick note right now, Noah, all we have is a black screen. It looks like below. But as we go through things, I'm still going to charge ahead, as they say. I like as many EV puns as possible. But I'll start by saying that we're in an interesting state of the market. We're halfway through the year. Obviously, the last quarterly market analysis, we talked about the impacts of the end of IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, the impacts of just sort of a big, huge federal policy shift on transportation electrification. And there's lots of other impacting factors that include our current tariff policies that kind of swing back and forth. And so all of these things ultimately have some form of impact on the state of the market. But there's an additional big one right now that I wanted to flag, which we've been going through over the last several months, which is the continued war in Iran and the impact to oil markets. And if you recall, and if you want to kind of dig back into the deep recesses of the Electrification Coalition, we wrote the Electrification Roadmap back in 2008. And the entire premise of the transportation or the Electrification Roadmap was that because of the price manipulation that can happen, and in some cases the impacts to supply that can happen with oil markets, it puts us at great economic and national security. And right now, oil continues to be and continues to have a monopoly on our transportation system in the U.S., even though we're making strides and chipping away at it year in and year out because of the growth in the EV market. But we're not moving fast enough, and the arguments we would make for this, in many cases, were sometimes harder over the last several years because we were a net producer of oil in the U.S. and prices felt a little bit more stable. But I think what the current war in Iran demonstrates is we might have some moments of stability when it comes to oil markets, but at the end of the day, when our transportation system is so reliant on one single fuel, it still puts us at great economic and national security risk, and it shows up in the form of gas prices that affects every consumer across the country. It affects businesses. It affects the price of goods. And we continue to have high gas prices, well over $3.49 across the country. We have some high marks that are well above $5 and $6. And so I think in general, it just shows that one of the best ways that we can inoculate and de-risk our this impact of oil on the U.S., on our economic and national security, is to figure out how we continue to accelerate fuel diversity. And in our case, the best scalable option or scalable alternative is transportation electrification. And so I'll tell you what, Noah, why don't we just remove that effort to go to the slide deck, and maybe we can just do the featured. I'll change us to the featured view. And sorry, we had a little bit of a login issue. And so I'm trying to figure out how we change our view really quickly. Well, while we get into it, why don't we do this, because I'm going to work on the back end, Stephanie and Lauren, for a brief second. And if you all wouldn't mind, maybe you could take a quick second and reintroduce yourself to the crowd. And while you do that, if you could just give, one key thing that you think is showing up in the EV market. And obviously we'll dig into these more deeply shortly. So just a quick introduction, if you would, and then one thing that you feel like jumps out right now as we're at the halfway point within the transportation electrification space. And Stephanie, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Stephanie Valdez Streaty. I'm Director of Industry Insights for Cox Automotive. So thank you so much for joining us today. So looking at Q2 and the first half of this year, I think the market's continuing to restructure. I think we're starting to find out what that natural demand is. I think looking at Q2 sales, even though they were down year over year about 21%, they're up about 15% quarter over quarter. And we're starting to see that year over year decline shrink. So I think that pull ahead that we had the Q3 of 2025, we're starting to figure out, okay, what's that natural demand the rest of the year. The other thing that I'm excited about for the rest of the year is that we have new product out, and they're starting to gain momentum Q2, and I think it's going to continue. And Loren can probably talk about this in detail, but the infrastructure is growing and it's becoming more reliable. So I think there's a lot of good things in play. And I think the other thing to highlight is the used market, right? There's a lot of off-lease vehicles coming into the market at different price points. And so I think that's going to continue to grow, even though it's a small share of the overall used market. I think it's really good to show about access and equity around EVs and get a new demographic into the vehicle and create more familiarity. So I think that's something to also look forward to the rest of this year.
Great. Loren, why don't we move to you now? Thank you, Stephanie. We'll come back to you in a second, Stephanie.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ben and Stephanie. Hi, everyone. Loren McDonald, founder of Chargeonomics. We track, just like Stephanie, we track EV and EV charging sales and data trends and things like that. Been doing that since about 2015. As far as like what stuck out to me this quarter was, I think a lot of people thought that high gas prices was going to create this big bump in EV slash, I'm going to use the term BEV to make it clear what we're talking about, fully electric EV models. But I think a lot of people thought that high gas prices, I mean, Ben, you talk about $3. Well, out here in California where I am, it's $6 and $7, right? But gas prices here have always been high. But I think a lot of people thought that high gas prices were like, woohoo, that's finally going to be the thing that gets mainstream America excited about EVs. There were a lot of studies that said that high gas prices was driving the highest level of interest in EVs and consumers of all time. And then, you know, I think as Stephanie pointed out, while we saw a little bump in Q2, it wasn't actually that significant. You know, and there's a couple of factors, right? We had the trough after Q3 last year, but I think a lot of us, I think Stephanie would probably agree that it would take 2 to 3 quarters to sort of work through the people that pulled forward their purchases like we did. We got an Audi Q6 e-tron last September to take advantage of the tax credit, even though we had a Tesla that didn't expire, the lease didn't expire until December. So I think a lot of people did things like that. And so I think most people, we've worked through that situation where we pulled forward. I think the thing that we actually saw was a big bump in hybrid and plug-in hybrid sales this quarter, greater than the bump in BEVs. And one of the main reasons for that is hybrids in particular require zero behavioral change in humans and drivers, right? It's just the car is just more efficient. And I think we're still in a phase of, despite all the improvements in the charging industry, people still have charger anxiety. They don't know that the chargers are there. They're confused by it, and that type of thing. So I think that was sort of really interesting fact that high gas prices didn't have this massive bump. The last thing I would say, Ben and Stephanie, is that when you look at the data and Cox's and Stephanie's data and break it down a little bit, if you remove Tesla and the 6 new models that came to market in Q2, that 14% bump was about half that, right? And so the rest of the automakers and existing EV models just are not growing very much, despite what we hoped was going to be the factor that would drive a huge increase in sales.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Stephanie, I want to come back to you and just maybe dig in a little bit more with the latest of your analysis. But I do think that there is this, we sometimes think the high gas prices is going to cause this immediate shift in consumer choice. But, a car is still one of the most expensive, second most expensive item that people buy, minus a house, right? And so it's going to take time for those to filter out, because it's not like someone immediately, like they might with other consumer goods, right? If the price of cereal goes up, right, you can immediately choose a different cereal to buy, or milk or eggs or any of these other things. Or you can make different choices, right? You might not buy eggs next month moment. But you can't quite do the same thing with a car, given that it's something that either you lease for some period of time, or you've purchased, and so you own it for some period of time unless you choose to sell it. But Stephanie, coming back to you a little bit, and I'm going to try and change the view here. I think it'll work to do it as gallery. I don't love that. We're going to keep it on speaker view. Sorry. What are some other things that jumped out in the report and that you might want to highlight for people? And let's also, can we remind people where they might find Cox's report, just so that way they know where to get the latest and greatest of your market analysis that you all do?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So yeah, like digging into the data a little bit more, there are about 14 models. If you look at Q2, 14 models that actually had year-over-year increase. And so I think, and that's kind of what's driving some of those volumes. If you think about Kia, the EV9 was up about 263%. And then once again, I mentioned this, but Toyota, I think having the CHR, the Woodland, the BZ, Subaru having Trailseeker and the Uncharted, I think having that new product, and the Bolt as well, very well priced. I think those new products, and Loren mentioned, you take the other, the ones that are new and Tesla out, there's less year or quarter increase. So I think that is kind of what I really kind of stood out for me. The other thing that's surprising is the Mach-E. The Mach-E still continues to sell. Its year-over-year volume's way down, but it's still like when it's in the top 5. And so I think that's, to me, and I think looking at the rest of the year, Ford's going to extend the Ford Promise and offering free home installation chargers. So that might help the Mach-E. And I think with Ford, we're all waiting for that universal EV platform to launch and see how that resonates with consumers. So I think that's just something also that stood out. But going back to what Loren was talking about, the hybrids, in just to kind of our data points, when we did a survey in May, when we asked consumers what would high gas prices, what would do to your consideration, and 56% that they would consider a hybrid because of gas prices. And then I think EVs were like 29%. So I think it's back to what Loren said, there's less friction. You don't have to worry about charging. The other thing with the growth in the hybrid market, I think, is also there's just more product. If you think about Toyota, the Camry is only now in hybrid, and that's one of the top selling sedans. The RAV4, hybrid and plug-in hybrid, very well selling vehicles. So I think that's the other thing too. So you have this convergence of product available and then demand. And then you have the high gas prices kind of pushing it even further along.
Yeah, Loren, one of the things you brought up is this sort of like, the idea that there's no behavior change that needs to happen with a hybrid. It is interesting because if you own an EV, you actually realize that the behavior change is far less dramatic than you think, right? But I think in many ways, both PHEVs and EVs, just traditional hybrids are a little bit of that gateway introduction. And they start to help people understand, this technology works really wonderfully. And so they're much more likely. But I don't know if there's anything around, you love to dig into models and what are jumping out, sort of like the Mach-E. Is there anything like that jumped out to you in the current state of the market?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is that I think in addition to Toyota, as Stephanie mentioned, the CHR had a good first quarter. Just about, I think it was about 3,800 sales, and it wasn't on sale for very long, right? So that's I think Toyota is fascinating, right? Because everybody always wants everybody's been saying for years they want an electric Toyota, right? And Toyota didn't offer it. Now that they are, we're actually starting to see pretty good sales. And by the end of this year, there will be 6 Toyota Motor Company BEVs, 4 Toyota and 2 Lexus, right? And the Lexus ES 300 is actually priced below the hybrid, right? The BEV version is the base one. The fancier upgraded one is more expensive, but that's going to be fascinating, right? So we're starting to see more price, competitiveness as well, with and without total cost of ownership. I think the second thing is Cadillac continues to be a really good story. So in Q2, they had their second highest percentage ever of the percentage of BEV sales of total at 34%. So a third of Cadillac's sales in Q2 were BEVs, and it was the highest back in the Q3 end of tax credit. It was like 41%, right? So that was, you have to sort of remove that, but it continues to be on this upward trend. And I think why that's so important to think about and fascinating is that Cadillac is like a really great product market fit, right? Phrase we like to use in technology and stuff. And that you think about, Cadillac's buyers tend to be older. They're buying a luxury vehicle. They probably have higher household incomes. Many times they're going to be more early adopters and stuff. And so I think and the other thing that's interesting about the Cadillac models is they're not weird looking, right? They look just like the gas versions, like they're big, SUVs, right? And so they're familiar, and most of them have, like 350, 400 miles of range, right? And so the point of that is while many automakers, still are not seeing strong sales, Cadillac is an example. If you build competitive EVs for the right market, the right customer segment, they will buy them. The last thing I would say is Teflon Tesla, right? Right. Like we went through this period where everybody was protesting. It was headline news every day about protesting Elon Musk and all this kind of stuff. Tesla had a great Q2, right? And so, never bet against Elon and Tesla, I think is the point there, right? And Tesla's sales were solid this quarter, and the question I'll throw out on the table is why is Tesla still so dominant when we now have like 80 BEV models available on the market? They still command roughly 50% of the market. I think it was a little bit less than that, but it's like, why do they continue to be so dominant?
Yeah, I don't know. Stephanie, do you have any thoughts on your end? Anything that shows up in the analysis on their market dominance?
I think some of it, is they've been around a long time, right? They have the high tech, familiarity with the product. I think maybe with the Model YL, that's going to probably even give them potentially more share opportunity in the latter part of the year.
Yeah.
Yeah,
there's some interesting things coming in the chat, and I don't disagree.
There's competition, but I think it's just they have a long head start.
Yeah, and my question was kind of rhetorical, right? And a lot of people answered it correctly, right? Which is several people have chatted saying the supercharger network, and I think that's the thing, right? Not to get too much into this and off track, but when Tesla launched the Model S in 2012, and then the supercharger network 2013, and then the destination charging network, the level 2 charging networks that you find at hotels and resorts and things like that, they understood. They were the only automaker that really understood, or at least admitted it, that if you really wanted to sell high volume of EVs, you had to solve the charging problem. And so they did that. And then guess what happened? Years later, you had Electrify America get in, not by choice. With Rivian jumped in, Mercedes jumped in. You have Iona with charging networks. It took like 10 years for sort of everybody to realize, oh yes, if we want to sell a lot of EVs, we actually have to solve the charging issue. And Stephanie mentioned the Ford Power Promise. I was actually, I think Stephanie, you were there as well. We were back there together at Dearborn at Ford last year. They invited a handful of us analysts back there. And while they didn't share numbers, they did share that the Ford Power Promise, where they provide free home charging with a limit, right, of installation costs and stuff, drove a significant increase in Mach-E sales, right? And so I think that's like 1/2 or 1/3 of this charging issue, right? If you can solve, first and foremost, for people being able to charge at home, then that gives them, the first level of confidence to buy an EV, because that's what they want, right? They want that ability to wake up in the morning with a full charge and not to have to go out to a public charger. So I think that's a really good program.
Yeah, I think the charging network ultimately is well known as being one of the best and most is across the country, and so you can kind of drive end to end. I've proved it. I've owned a Tesla, and we drove from here to I live in North Carolina, and we drove to Moab and back, and it was fairly seamless. And it's an integrated software solution, right? So it shows up on the car and all of that. And so I think if you talk to a Tesla owner or a Tesla driver, they'll tell you about those things and why that works so well. I do think it is good, and even though it's taken longer to happen, but Iona being a great example of the rest of the auto industry trying to respond and putting resources into building out a competitive charging network. And if you've gone to one of the rechargeries at Iona, and I think Electrify America, BP Pulse, several others, they've all started to really build out, examples of a charging experience that rivals the Tesla experience. I think the other part is we're also in this transition, and this is just for everyone, where the Tesla charging standard is now the standard, and so that also matters a lot because it means it's a more seamless experience for any consumer, where they can access both Tesla charging network and also non-Tesla charging network. And the same for Tesla owners, for that matter, is that they can access both the Tesla network and non-Tesla network. So maybe and I know you were just about to jump in, so hang tight for 1 second, Loren, because I'm going to come back to charging, but I want to focus on vehicles for another minute. Because one of the things that jumps out to me is it's the continued growth of the used market. And Stephanie, I would love if you could share a little bit about what is showing up in the used market. It seems to be growing at an incredibly significant rate. I sometimes wonder if it's not suppressing new car sales. But it's hard to try to draw the correlation directly to that data. But what are we seeing in the used car market, and even what are we expecting as we go into the remainder of the year?
As we all know, the IRA, the lease, the commercial credit was really effective selling tool, and it resonated with consumers. And so like 1.4 million EVs released from 2023 to 2025. So those are starting to come off lease now, entering the used market. And so the used EV volume has tripled since 2023. This quarter, it was 118,000, and that was up 18.3%. It's still a small share, it's 2.6, but I think it's looking at that trajectory, which is key. And I think this actually goes, I think, part of the new conversation, new EV and used EV. It's not just Tesla, Model Y, Model 3. There's all kinds of options. And it's interesting, I was looking at June data, Cadillac, and this kind of goes to the new sales, right? Cadillac is starting to enter that used market. And so I do think, to your point, it'll be interesting as you start to see a lot of these Model Ys or Model 3s come off lease, or even like you think Ioniq, vehicle or Mach-E, whatever make, and you can, and you're considering buying a new one, but you could get a 3-year-old one at a lower price. We haven't seen anything in the data yet that can show what's happening, but to your question, I could see somebody opting for a used, knowing that they can save a lot of money and still get a lot of great tech and get good value for that vehicle. And the depreciation, is usually that it's the most during those first 3 years, right? So that's the best time to buy that used vehicle as well. And if you can charge at home, that's even more of a stronger value proposition from a total cost of ownership.
A big question that was coming up in new car sales, right, was the residual value. Like, what is my car going to be worth? And that's not, necessarily how most consumers think about that, but it does come into play. Is the car going to be worth anything when I've got to sell it at some point? Especially when people who are buying newer cars on a continuous basis. Are we seeing the sort of price, stabilize a little bit? And I know we talked about it during the Q1 analysis, that it was really starting to show up a little bit differently.
The auction, the EV values are doing really well. And I think that's because the dealers that are going into buying those used EVs, they see there's a perfect opportunity right now, right? There's a lot of good product. Gas prices, right, potentially could be something to position that well. And so I think right now we're seeing those values hold up. And I think as we get more and more data long term, I think the depreciation models will be more sophisticated and we'll have more data. Like with ICE, right, it's all about miles, and we have all kinds of data we're still new into this game with EVs. And so I think that's one of the key points is we need more data to really start tracking what that depreciation schedule should be.
Yeah, I think part of it is even just in the last couple of years, the difference between the used vehicle and the new vehicle on performance characteristics, range, how quickly it can charge isn't that different. Versus if you looked at it even 3 or 4 years ago, the used vehicles that were available might have had significantly different range, different charging characteristics. And so I think that's an interesting thing that I'm curious to see how that level out. I'm not sure how much consumers dig into that completely, but I think it does start to show up when it's easy to just go range to range comparison. The new car versus the used car is not that different. And that wasn't the case just a couple of years ago. So
yes, Stephanie,
go ahead.
I'm curious, do you have any data that backs the idea that there are people that just buy new cars and there are people that just buy used cars? But is that potentially changing a little bit with the used EV market, right? Like I can see, I live in a, upscale suburban neighborhood out here in California where the kids all drive like BMWs or whatever to high school and stuff. Actually, most of them drive Jeep Wranglers. But, I was thinking, I'm wondering if the new trend will be parents buying their kids like used EVs, right? And people buying used EVs for their commuter car. And things like that. I'm wondering if that stereotype A is even true, but B, because of this, like you can get a 3-year-old used EV for like $25,000 less than new one. It's basically the same car, right? That is it bringing a new customer segment into the used market?
No, I totally agree. I don't have any concrete data other than I was at a used car summit earlier this year, and it was a dealer panel that sold used EVs, and they said that they're getting a lot of boomers coming in, or parents buying for their kids, right? These used EVs. So I think that's just anecdotal, but I think you're right, Lauren. I think it's opening up a whole new demographic who's going to buy these vehicles and then expose them to other people. So I think it's only going to help the overall adoption.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
It is. I do think it's going to be this interesting moment, right, where you have the early adopters. In many cases, now it's going to be the children of the early adopters. And I mean, in my case, both of my kids, I have a 9 and a 14-year-old. They've never actually had any other experience except for being in an EV, which is pretty wild. And I think we're going to have more and more of that. That's going to change the view of whether or not these are an inconvenience or are they actually a superior technology. Lauren, go ahead.
Well, my youngest daughter's 26 and she drives a Tesla Model 3. So, there you go. Right.
Perfect. Yeah. Perfect example.
And actually to tie the two conversations together, I actually told her not to, we had 3 Teslas, then the Audi and stuff. I told her not to get a Tesla for a variety of reasons. I mean, Teslas are great, right? But her reason for getting one was she was comfortable with the charging experience because she'd been with us in 3 different Teslas and knew how to do it. I think she would have been fearful of the charging experience in a non-Tesla, not necessarily for valid reasons, but just she was comfortable with that experience, having experienced it for like 10 years.
I will share. I own an Ioniq 5, and so one of the experiences is we've sort of tested it relative to our Tesla experience, and it keeps up to par. And I think what it tells me is that the rest of the automotive industry has really worked hard to catch up on the charging network, and so that's still something that we have to that is going to take consumers a little time to adjust to. Because they're not used to seeing them in the same way they see gas stations. It's why I sometimes made the joke that really our charging approach should be just to put a bunch of dummy chargers all across the country so that consumers would feel confident. And then once they actually own one, they'd never need that many chargers.
Yeah, maybe. And I don't know if we're going to drill into that later, Ben, but I think that's one of the single biggest hurdles is just what you talked about, right? In fact, it was a funny thing. I had a post about the EV to charging ratio this morning on LinkedIn, and somebody commented saying, I'm not in the market for an EV, but I've noticed that there's 3 new fast charging stations near my house, and that makes it more intriguing, right? And I think that's like, an interesting anecdote, but I think it to your point, that is one of the single biggest issues is that even though we're building fast charging stations at an unprecedented pace, your average consumer doesn't see them. They don't know they're there.
Yeah.
Right.
So
They're invisible.
You brought it up, though, saying we're building them at an unprecedented pace. And I know it's something that you spend a lot of time analyzing. So what is that growth change look like? Where are we at on the charging network? What are some of the things that jump out that you think are interesting around the growth in charging across the country?
Yeah, I mean, we're and I'm going to get this number incorrect, but we're at about, I think, 77,000 fast charging ports in the U.S. And when I say ports, what I mean by that for everybody is basically one car can charge at a charger at a time. That's the definition of a port. And so some of the things that are happening is we have these new players, like you mentioned, Iona and Walmart and BP Pulse and Costco's in the game now, and on and on and on. So you have these new players, many of which have not much of a footprint, right? So Iona has talked specifically about their number one goal right now is to build out a national footprint so that they can be a national network, right? So they're building out without economics in mind, right? They're just building to have that scale. Then they're going to worry about economics later. Whereas you look at Tesla, Electrify America, EVgo that already have national networks, they're focused on profitability. So they're building out more stations where the rideshare drivers are and the apartment complexes are. They're sort of doing infill. So that's one of the trends. Another trend is the high power chargers, the 350, 400 kW chargers are sort of becoming the standard, especially for the all the new players like the Walmarts and Ionas, et cetera. We're also starting to see finally significant growth in the installation of the NACS connector, the formerly known as Tesla connector. And I think that the charging networks, the CPOs are running a little bit behind on that. Even though almost every new EV model coming out this year will come standard with a NACS port. I think there might be one that isn't, but I think they're being very cautious and they're waiting for the market to catch up. But I think, Ben, one of the negative trends, if you will, is after the sort of the mess with the NEVI program, which was really designed not to build a lot of charging stations, but to build them where the charging networks were not going to, because they didn't make economic sense. So out, in South Dakota and North Dakota and rural Alabama and all those kind of places, everybody's pretty much focused on just putting them where there's high demand, right? And so that's a challenge for those people. I have a brother-in-law that says, I'm never gonna get an EV until I can drive from, here in Idaho to there or whatever it is. And I hear there's no charging stations there, right? And so if we're not building out those charging stations in the less EV adopting, high EV adopting markets, that's going to make a lot of people nervous. Like, I want to take that road trip and I don't think I can, right? So I think that's one of sort of the negative trends.
Yeah, I think there's lots of things about the NEVI program that were really well designed, and then ultimately, in some cases, it was about the sort of messaging and getting embroiled in politics, and even the conversation that we've had about what types of vehicles are selling well. I think unfortunately are good examples where it's we've politicized EVs instead of it being about the technology and the virtues of the technology, and in some ways, it's unavoidable, probably. But I think the more and more that it is connected to economic and national security interests, competition with China, the more and more that can focus on the policy debate, which is what do we need to do to move faster? Because the rest of the world is going electric much faster than the US is. What does that mean we need to do to preserve the US automotive industry, whether that's even, other automotive sector or other Japanese manufacturers, et cetera, that are building in the US, manufacturing in the US, et cetera. But how do we continue to make sure that there's, we build EVs in the US and we build the future of transportation, and not just sort of putting ourselves in a position where we're closing the borders and we only have, internal combustion engines. And so I think there's just a lot of different factors at play. So I'm going to come back to vehicles for a second. So Stephanie, one of the questions that came up in the chat, and I think it's a good question, and we talked about it last time, but some of the manufacturers are moving to the extended range EV, which basically, for those playing along at home, there's basically means a small engine, much bigger battery, and the idea being that you have the engine is more of a backup than the primary driver versus a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. But the engineering and the design is going to be a little different for every automaker. But what do you see that? How do you think that's going to impact the market? What kind of analysis might be showing up around the impacts of EREVs?
Yeah, I definitely think, especially if you think about the use case where I need a truck, right? You think about the F-150, right? It's going to become an EREV, right? Because if you think about people that want to use that as a utility vehicle or for work or whatever, they want that range. And once again, we're talking about charging, right? That if they're going to need more charging, is it reliable? Is it accessible? So I think the EREVs are going to be effective in that certain use cases for those people that need that range, kind of like plug-in hybrids currently. But I think they still get the feel of an EV, driving the EV with the EREV. And so I think you look at Scout, a lot of those reservations are for EREVs. So I think we're going to start to see those in the market. I think they'll do well to fill that gap for people who have concerns about charging, accessibility, and reliability.
And some of the early stage EVs were actually those examples of EREV. So like the BMW i3 was a good example. Yep. The Volt, in some ways, was sort of a version of an EREV. This is where we start to nerd out and we get into all of the differences. I do think some of this is we probably get caught up in the EV nerddom but the rest of the consumers are just wondering, can I drive from point A to point B, to kind of get back to your premise, Loren, of can I get from wherever I need to go to, or from where I am to where I need to go. Yeah. So, Stephanie, when you also look at the sort of the state of the global market versus the U.S. market, are there any things that really jump out to you? And I know you just had a chance to go visit Norway, who is a very small number of people in the world, right? 5 million, but right now 90% of the vehicles sold in the market are EVs, and so more than, in fact.
Yeah, Norway was good. I know, Ben, you've been there. It was just a good reminder of when you have consistent policy and you have collaboration, you can really accelerate adoption. And granted, they are small, they have lots of money, and it's a really good situation for EV adoption. But I think when you think about globally, the rest of the world is growing globally, right? Electrification, and we see that in all the different markets. And that's one. If you think we're talking about gas prices, it might not happen in the US, but in other parts of the world, gas prices have definitely increased EV acceleration. And I think, you can't have a conversation in global EV adoption without talking about China. I mean, China continues to, they have overcapacity. And their demand at China is declining. So they need to export those vehicles, and they're doing that, and they're gaining share throughout the different parts of the world. And I guess for the US, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in Canada. That's going to be a good kind of benchmark to see kind of how it does there. The other thing with this is more global, and I'm thinking about China with all these new EVs. What's going to happen to the used EV market with those Chinese EVs? Like, they iterate so quickly and have new products that come out. And we're talking about residual values and depreciation. It's going to be interesting to see how all that's managed. But I think there are, but in the US, I think that's one thing where, there's alignment to keep the Chinese OEMs out, whether it's through tariffs or the connected car rule. But one way they are getting exposure is through social media, TikTok, talking about, influencers talking about the Chinese vehicle. So I think they're getting more awareness, especially to the younger generation in the US. So I'm not sure what kind of impact that has if there's more awareness about these Chinese OEMs and vehicles that they offer in the low price point. But I think that's going to continue to grow, I think, the awareness of the Chinese offerings.
And I'd be failing if I didn't mention there are serious security concerns about the role of Chinese EVs. And it's a reason that even in Europe and other places where they've allowed Chinese EVs to enter the market, they don't actually allow people to drive Chinese EVs that are connected to military or near bases. And so those are real concerns that, just are yet to be defined and fully understood, and what the impact of those things, even things like a kill switch, meaning that they could just turn them off at any one point. Will that happen? Maybe not, but it's just still a thing where there's a question there about that. Not to mention then, and you brought it up, but they have overcapacity, and there's history in China because they are, in many cases, supported by the Chinese government, that they can essentially wait out. They can play the long game, and they've done that in many instances, whether it's solar or other forms of the industry. And so I think there's a lot of concern that if we don't pay attention to how to compete with China and how to ensure that we have strong U.S. competition both in Europe and in the U.S., that we could really let China run roughshod over the entire automotive industry, and that isn't necessarily a good thing. And it could be something where we're sort of trading the challenges of economic and national security impacts of oil dependency for the economic and national security impacts of Chinese EV dependency. And so it's important to think through all of those, and it's why I would make the argument we need a strong and robust policy approach in the U.S. and strong ambition so that we maintain that competition. But so one of the other questions that's come up a little bit is there's new entrants coming into play, and so either Loren and or Stephanie, what do you all think about the potential for things like the new Rivian, the R2, and what that's going to mean, which is just now available for orders, or the Slate truck, which is growing quickly in interest, and is a very curious product for me, compelling but also curious. So I don't know if either of you have a take.
Yeah, I'll start, Stephanie. I think one of the things that I think a lot about is the sort of the variation of the Osborne effect concept, right? Like there's more than 24 BEV models that are supposed to come out this year. We've already had, I think, about 7 or something come to the market. So there's still a lot more to come. BMWs, more Toyotas, Lexus, the R2, which is out now, et cetera. And so I'm wondering, if one of the things I'm thinking is there might be a lot of people that are sort of interested in getting an EV right now, but they're going, if I just wait 6 months or 9 months or a year, these like even better vehicles are going to be coming out. The lower priced R2, the Ford, which they were calling the mid-size pickup, they're now saying it's a small-size pickup, right? Which looks to be amazingly good, right? It's like it checks all the boxes numbers-wise and everything like that. And so, Stefan, I don't know your thoughts on this, but I'm thinking there might be a lot of people who are, EV intenders, as we say, but they're going, gosh, if I just wait 6, 9, 12 months, like there's going to be EVs that are so much better that are out there, or less priced and stuff. And specifically on the R2, I don't know if Stephanie and Ben, if you've ever seen a new vehicle get as positive reviews by auto journalists as that car, and all of them saying, I've got a reservation. If I could afford it, I would buy one and stuff. But I'm not dubious that it's going to have the sales volume that RJ Scaringe wants and stuff. They're talking about a capacity of 150,000 a year, which puts it in the Model 3 sort of range and stuff. I think if it does 75 to 100, that would be amazingly good, and the best ever of an EV in the US, not named Tesla. I'll stop there. I have thoughts on the Slate as well.
Stephanie, what do you think?
Rivian, I think it's very aspirational. I think the standard, right, if that were to, I think that's going to sell well, right, because it's at that lower price point.
Right.
But I do think even if you take a broader look at just the overall economics of the current economic environment, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. Consumer sentiment is down. And when consumer sentiment is down, that usually leads to consumer buying going down. And I think for any large purchase item like a car, consumers are just going to hold off in general. Like there's high interest rates. So I think there's just, that's also the headwind. Just
all those great lease deals are gone too. Right. Like last year we all leased like I cut my lease payment on the Audi in half from what I was paying for the Model Y, right? Because of the tax credit and stuff.
Right.
But there was some insane lease deals in 2025. And, the R2, the current one, I think it's like $865, the lease payment or something like that, right? So
Yeah,
it needs to
it's
get
like the
down to
new
like
car. Yeah,
400 or
it's pushing.
500.
Yeah, it's pushing out a large segment of the population to buy those new vehicles.
Yeah, I think affordable EVs ultimately are always something where we need that as a part of the market entry. It's sometimes when we even talk about like the R2, it's not that surprising that they'd be starting with their top trim model first. That's what every car maker does when they
Tesla
introduce.
did, right? Yep.
Yeah, it's a new vehicle. They always start with the top trim model, so that's not unique to EVs. Sometimes EVs get like all the baggage without the recognition that that's how the industry works writ large, not just EVs. With the idea of the R2, I very curious. I've never, the Ioniq had similar, I think, buzz about like it just being a very compelling vehicle when it came out. It's, a couple of years now down the road. But I do think it's going to be very interesting. And that mid-size SUV is a, really sweet spot for the American public right now.
Crowded
kind of vehicle that they're looking for. But yeah, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about like new vehicle entrants that are coming in. And Lauren, you mentioned the BMW, it's a 400 to 500 mile range vehicle that's coming out. It's going gangbusters in Europe. So, I don't know, Stephanie or Lauren, if there's any view you all have about some of those types of vehicles and what impact they may have.
I think the BMW will do well. I know you mentioned Slate. I think Slate, it's interesting, and I think, Ben, we talked a little bit about it on a previous call, but they're partnering with Crayola, and I think there's going to be a certain demographic that's going to resonate with the a culture, go viral, and like I'm a Slate owner, and there's like kind of like the Scout community, and I also think there's also the use case if you're you have a fleet and you want to buy some vehicles that are low priced. You don't have to do a lot of mileage. It makes a really good, strong value proposition. So Slate will be interesting to see what happens. I think the Ford that's going to be launched competes against it, has more mileage, all that. So that could, dig into.
And 4 doors and and power windows and screen and right. Like that's the thing when you actually when a lot of people add those basics onto the base Slate and the delivery fee and stuff like that, and it has significantly less range than the upcoming Ford, right? I think it's going to be tough, right? I think a lot of people who will go for the Ford, right? But we'll see. I think the other thing on like the BMWs, Mercedes has the CLA out that's like getting really good reviews, except for the NACS connector issue. You can't charge as fast as a supercharger and stuff. It's getting dinged for that. There's I think it's a mid-sized Mercedes SUV that I'm not sure if it's on sale yet or not, Stephanie, or just started, but that's coming. And those are like compelling from a range perspective. And I think the broader thing, Ben and Stephanie, is that we're starting to see the Gen 2, Gen 3 BEV models come out from these major automakers, right? And they're much more compelling from a range and charging power and software. I mean, that's the biggest issue, right? Like, I hope I don't offend anybody on this call, but like, we love our Audi, but the software is just not where it needs to be, right? And I think that's still a holdup with a lot of the legacy automakers. Like, they're nailing like the range and a lot of different things in the interior and all those types of things, but they're just they're still behind on kind of the technology and the software. And that's what the Chinese are like nailing, right? Because they started with blank sheets.
Yeah, although back to your question about Tesla, right? They have that tech, and that's one of the driver for the vehicle, same as Rivian.
Yeah, I think there's part of it though is that like the tech matters a lot for new, the sort of tech forward thinking people,
the
right?
younger demographic, is that what you're trying to say?
Not going to say that. No, but what I think there's still a question settled around like what is the right tech level and what do people want as that experience, right? And the infotainment system, because in many instances, some people really miss the analog version and feel overwhelmed. And I think it's just that's still a question, and it's part of why ice cream comes in 32 flavors or whatever, is that not everybody likes the same thing. And, in some ways it's good that there's going to be choice amongst the automakers and what the experience is. And yes, if you're tech forward, you do notice a big difference between, somebody like Tesla has vertical integration, has spent a ton of years developing the tech side, and then the new autos. But, you could make the argument in reverse and go, yeah, Tesla's had quality control issues and they're loud and they, the suspension wasn't that great early on and some of those things, that they fixed throughout the years, but they were much better at the tech and less good at building a car. And so there's some of those changes that take place over time. So, okay, we have about 8 minutes left. It's amazing how quickly we burn through time and a really active conversation, and appreciate it. There's a few things that showed up in the chat I just want to mention. One is, public charging is much more expensive than home charging, 100% true. Hard to help consumers sort of think that through and think through the economics, but it does matter. At the end of the day, though, public charging is still cheaper most of the time than gas, and especially when you can know the certainty, because electricity is very certain. The other things that have come up, and I'm just trying to flag a few of these questions, is one that came up, and I think it's a good question. I'm not sure everybody has the same answer, is do we have an affordability problem in the American household and the own and buy EVs? And so Stephanie, what's your what's the affordability issue? What does that really mean? How is that playing out in the market? What's showing up for new cars?
I think that, you think of the average new car is close to 50,000. And interesting, I don't have the data in front of me, but like if you look at the price of cars in terms of like how they've increased year over year, it's normal, increase in cost. But what's really driving it a lot is the interest rates, the insurance, the maintenance. And I think that's a good for EVs, right? Lower maintenance. So you don't have to incur that. But I think it's just all these things have increased and really caused the overall cost of owning a vehicle out of reach from a lot of people. And so I think we do have an affordability crisis. And so I think it's important to, be able to talk about this. This is kind of like pushing EVs, like talking about if you can buy used EV for $23,000 and you can charge at home and you're going to have lower maintenance, that makes a lot of sense from an affordability. So I think there's some options out there. Just need to figure out how do we better educate people on what those options are.
Yeah, the interesting thing, though, Stephanie, and I don't know if your data agrees with mine. I did a roll up by brands. I added up all the like 19 or 31, whatever it was, brands by their total sales. In Q2 2026 was up a little bit over Q2 2025 and up like pretty significantly over Q1. So despite all of these rises in cost and gas prices and affordability issues and stuff, people bought more cars in general in Q2.
Yeah, I think in the market, I think we're forecasting like 15.8 million for total car volume,
which for the year, which would be down a little bit.
Yeah. And so I think,
but Q2, at least by my numbers, was really good. It was a solid quarter.
Yeah. I think the second half will be probably maybe more challenging potentially. I don't know.
Yeah.
And just to clarify for everyone, we're talking about the entirety of the car market, not just EVs.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when we talk about analysis, we're not always talking about like the fact that we have 8 million EVs on the road in the US. That's a big number. It's actually a lot more than most, sort of average people out there might think. And when we're talking about the market performance, though, that's a percentage. And so it's like, what's the market percentage that we're experiencing in addition to total units?
Yeah, I was just pulled up our data right now. So this is year to date through June. The overall market is down 2.4%.
Okay. Yeah, I was comparing quarter over quarter and stuff, but yeah, but it's not down like
15,
10, 20,
20%. Yeah.
30% or anything like
Yeah.
that. It's roughly flat,
But it goes back to this K economy. It's like this higher economic quintile is really pushing the new car volume forward because it's,
Right. I think that was the sort of earlier part when we were talking about who are the sort of the new car buyers versus the used car buyers. And that's why when we talk about EVs, yes, more $30,000 BEV models will help grow sales, but the people that buy new BEV models tend to be higher income and price. I have a lot of friends who are still driving gas cars, but who did like 3 IPOs or whatever. Like these people can afford any car they want, but they still don't pull the trigger because one of the biggest points that I want to leave with is the why. Like they still don't know why they should buy an EV, right? And they're still concerned about charging.
Well, I think that's an interesting leaping off point here. We have 2 minutes.
that
and
could be the next call,
yeah,
Ben, the why. I think that's
right.
like
The why. Why should I buy an EV?
Why.
I have no less than 100 reasons. I'm sure that I could compel them with, but people still have to believe themselves. And we are in this transition stage, and it's just like going from a typewriter to a computer, a major computer to a laptop. Like these are things that just take a little bit to sort of move through the public consciousness and their experience. But
I know we're short on time, but I always think about the transition from, cell phones, flip cell phones to smartphones, right?
Yeah.
Like if you think back then, nobody said Apple should price the iPhone the same as a cell phone, right? It was $600 or $500 versus $200 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Because the smartphone was way better than your cell phone. Like and I think that's my point about the why. Like we as EV nerds can say, it's quiet, it doesn't pollute, it's fast, it's all this kind of stuff. But to 98% of America that's still not driving an EV, they focus on the negatives, right? You have to charge it, and they're concerned about battery life, and sort of they look at the reasons not to buy. And I think what we really need to focus on is like the why. And that's why I'll leave my parting thought that maybe could be a conversation, a future one, is so that I think bi-directional charging, being able to use your car to back up when you have those power outages in Michigan, which is like they have like 40 of them a year. Like that's the game changer, because then nobody can say, I can do that with my gas car.
Yep. Love that.
Okay, Stephanie, you got 30 seconds. What's any last?
One thing I'll leave is, I know we talked about hybrid increasing and share and all that and used EV market. So I think for the hybrid market, that's just building a pipeline for future EV buyers. So I think it's not a negative thing that HEVs are growing in share. I think it's going to help lead us to future EV adoption. So I think it's a positive thing. So I'll lead with that.
Great. I'm going to wrap up and just say, I'm very curious to see the impact of the oil prices and the continued challenges that exist within the gas market. I think it already showed up big time with JD Powers, where the EV curious number went way up. There's also the long-term net effect of EV owners say they never go back. And that's just, that's pretty compelling. And it's kind of like the smartphone analogy that you made, which is once you've gone from a flip phone to a non-flip phone, you're pretty unlikely to go back to to the flip phone, because the technology is so superior. And I think we're just in that stage, and we have a need to develop more policy tools to make sure that it helps consumers understand the value benefits, because once they get behind the wheel, they're probably going to stay behind the wheel of an EV. My last bit here is, I think it's still at this point, and I know it is just a question of when, not if, we will be driving electric vehicles in the US. And the policy is going to have a big impact on that. But hopefully the automakers are also jumping to the call and figuring out more compelling vehicles to produce. And how do we keep driving down the cost, which will happen over time. Used vehicles, great thing to look at right now. Charging networks growing quickly. Cars go faster. They go further. They charge faster. So lots of reasons why an EV makes sense. But again, thank you all so much for being here, Stephanie and Loren and the crowd. If you have friends who didn't see this and you want to share this with them, this video will be out there so that you can share it. They can watch it at another time. And then we will, of course, do the next one next quarter and look forward to talking with everybody at that point as well. So thank you all for joining. Thanks for the great conversation. And we'll look forward to the next time.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.